right. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Gompertz. I'm one of the partners and owners of QRx Partners.
And I'm here with Steve. This is Mark Swanson, the other of the two partners at QRx Partners.
Great. So we're going to talk about continuing our theme of looking at warning letters as we do each week for our inadequate response postings on LinkedIn to do a quarterly review. We did one for Q1. If you haven't seen that discussion, it's available on our YouTube channel. And then, of course, obviously, we're going to focus on Q2 today and see what kind of trends were going on in the last 3 months with FDA.
Yeah.
All right, so just looking at the numbers, the kind of the distribution hasn't changed as to what the focus appears to be. The order has kind of stayed the same, with drugs being number one, tobacco number two. But we do see an increase in those areas as
To say,
well.
it looks like they're getting a little more active.
Yeah, right. I think I don't know. We've had all this worry about FDA's losing people, right, with the shift in the administration. But for whatever they're doing, I don't know if they just towards Q1 we're kind of in a holding pattern, and now they're just letting loose on their what resource they have, or they found a way to be more efficient. But yeah, they are definitely picking up the pace here. Um, the drugs, are clearly leading the way, and I can talk a little bit later about, I think part of that is you'll see there's a good chunk of that is FDA targeting these internet pharmacies that's just sort of pop up and will literally sell you any drug without a prescription, even like controlled substances, kind of stuff. There was a bunch of those this quarter, and last quarter there were some. So I think there's kind of a pattern they're going after there. Tobacco, a lot of vaping related stuff popping up. So I think that's increasing it.
Sure.
And on the food side, again, we focus more on the drugs and devices, which is really going to be the focus today. But on the food side, what I have noticed um, is a lot more warning letters coming out of the kind of the foreign inspection program. And I think that's not a surprise, given the current administration's focus on dealings with other countries, that FDA has probably gotten the message as well. Let's start, really making sure we're watching all those imports of foods. And I think they had announced that towards the end of last year that they were going to step up their foreign inspections across the board. So I see a lot of that in the food stuff. And then devices kind of staying. It's a little bit bigger, but pretty much staying as expected there. Any other thoughts on that, Mark?
No, I think you're a little bit right on there. I mean, we forget that the current administration only came into being at the end of 2024, right? And so into the beginning of 2025, there was kind of a lot of pause on several things as they adjusted to the current administration's thinking on things. So there might have been just a little slowdown in Q1 rather than really saying that things got tougher in Q2. Maybe it's
Yeah,
just back to normal business in Q2.
yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely a possibility there. All right, let's go break this down a little bit more. I always like to put this one up because I think you can get lulled into when if you see a particularly bad warning letter from a company out of Asia or India and go, see, that's the problem, right? Is foreign manufacturers. But I think that the data shows you the U.S. companies are fully capable of screwing things up just as well. Right. I mean, the drug side, you can see U.S. is a little bit closer to the 50%, although that internet piece where you don't really know where they're located, I think I think some of those are U.S. based. It's hard to tell at times. But yeah, before we get, start going, oh, look, yeah, it's always those outside the U.S. companies that are the problem. No, I think the severity is worse outside the U.S., particularly when you see like facility conditions. I think
Right.
that becomes more problematic.
Contaminations, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but when it comes to the CGMP kind of stuff, I don't think U.S. companies have any problem with getting that wrong,
Right.
unfortunately, versus their foreign counterparts. So yeah, that's why I like to always put this up just to kind of clarify that, hey, this is not an OUS problem. It is a US problem. They're all capable of not doing
Well,
the right thing.
I wonder sometimes that, those coming from the US say, well, we live under these laws and rules. We know what we're doing,
Mhm.
and maybe you want to say, we've seen it a few times, right? Where they'll say to the FDA, "Oh, no, 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 we know what we're doing. You're not right." And that's never a good pathway to go down.
We just wrote about that today in in the post for inadequate response about the wearable, where the company's saying, "Nope, FDA, you don't understand your own regulations. What we're doing is just fine." That's like a whole nother half hour right there.
Yeah,
Talk about that segment
for sure.
we could do. But anyway, so yeah, so I think there's some interesting data always to look at the geography. Um, when we look at the types of violations, and this kind of comes from the titling that they give to the warning letters, I thought it would be interesting to break this out. Um, CGMP and adulterated always kind of go hand in hand. The adulterated is always a little bit larger. It's hard to tell on these than the CGMP. But typically, if you're violating CGMP, by definition, you're adulterated is kind of the way that goes. But there are ways to be adulterated other than CGMP violations. But they do tend to go hand in hand when you look at the distribution. And then it's just okay. So what else is out there? And on the device side, failure to get an IDE in place or a PMA is fairly prevalent. Misbranding, not as big an issue in devices as it is in drugs. Um, Typically the misbranding, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, comes from a failure to notify FDA of things like MDRs, which is considered a form of misbranding.
Okay.
And then there was one BMO, same thing. The CGMP, leading to adulteration and other forms of adulteration are far and away the big issue. Misbranding becomes, I think, a bigger thing on the drug side because of the drugs, the labels, right? Not having all of the contents all of the components of the drug correctly listed, either missing stuff or getting the quantities wrong. Seems to
Right.
be a common theme there. The unapproved drugs, there's definitely a pattern there, and that's why a lot of those, not necessarily the online pharmacies, but you're seeing, we'll see there's a number of warning letters to companies that are producing creams and salves and things like that, not either not realizing or not caring that they are technically classified as a drug. There are like analgesic creams that companies are selling to tattoo parlors, right, to numb the skin. Well, that's a drug. You're altering the functioning of the tissue. That, by definition, is a drug through chemical means. And you have to go through the NDA process for that. Um, the green piece there, I kind of put together three areas where there was just one warning letter each. One was an investigator not following, their clinical protocols. Somebody not managing their supply chain. Well, I thought that was an interesting one. One who just didn't list um, their drug. And then the compounding one is always interesting to me. I think there were three of those. Um, Compounding pharmacies play an important role, for certain patients who need a drug in a different form than it's normally sold, right? Maybe they can't swallow, so they need an injectable version of it, right? Or they take so many drugs, they need a combined version of it, or you need flavorants add or something, right? So there's important stuff there. But I think what we're going to start seeing is more of this as, right, the compounding pharmacies are playing a role in trying to reduce the cost of popular drugs like the GLP-1s for weight loss.
Yeah.
The sexual health drugs, I think, were another one of those that caused compounding pharmacies to jump in. And I think they're rushing, right? And they're missing a lot of stuff. I haven't looked in about 6 months, but the last time I looked at the overall data for compounding pharmacies, 75% of them can't make it through an FDA inspection without significant 483 observations. Not like trivial things. It's like, oh, here's four or five things you're doing wrong, and they're pretty serious. Or even just not even conforming to the requirements that allow them to be a compounding pharmacy under 503B. Um, and I think, a lot of it sounds like they're just trying to rush to get a chunk of the market. And
Well, I think to me it was a reason that if you go back to and people will understand the laboratory developed test rules that were kind of put together when a whole bunch of people jumped into helping diagnose COVID
Mm.
and those laboratory tests, and did it incorrectly. That's what drew the FDA's attention and the reason they wrote the rule. Now, they didn't do a very good job at it, and obviously that was repealed. But to me, some of the same things happen in compounding where, you get a pharmacy um, that'll read that part of the regulation and say, "Oh, we can do this," and just jump in without understanding that they need to have some appropriate controls in there. And again, not having those in place is akin to deciding you're going to sell a medical device without going through the process,
Right.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I agree. So let's break this down a bit. So let's go to the device side of things for a bit. Um, so again, right, that adulterated and misbranded, is contributes quite a chunk to this. And as I said, the adulterated in particular overlaps with the CGMP. A lot of the trending seems to be around reporting, which leads to the misbranding, as I said before, where companies are just not putting in place the right rationale or criteria to determine when they're supposed to file a medical device report. A lot of the warning letters were around that they're misbranded because they're failing to provide required records, or actually, it sounds even harsher. They say refusing to provide requested records or something like that, which makes it sound like FDA asked for it. But what they're saying is you're supposed to know when to contact FDA, and you're not doing it. Your procedure doesn't allow for the right decisions, and therefore you're not doing it at all, or you're doing it late, or you're doing it under the wrong circumstances. So that was, like I said, you can see from the Pareto far away the biggest element of that. Then CGMP violations are a big part of that, and then followed by a number of other things. And so then when you break out the CGMP violations, well, there's a shock. Kappa's number one again, right? Forever, right? It's just
Right.
cemented into that number one spot. I don't know why we can't get that better. Well, I do know, right? You and I have talked about this. It When you look at it, it's not that people don't have a decent companies don't have a decent CAPA procedure, is that they don't know how to feed it, right? They don't have that process thinking in their quality system.
I almost think, and lots of times lately, what I've been seeing is they actually identify the problem. They
Mhm.
just don't understand how to fix it, and they do temporary or things that aren't actually aimed at, the causes,
Right.
and what they do is inadequate. And so that,
Yeah. They do corrections instead of corrective action, right?
right,
Which is a
right,
band-aid, right?
right.
And they get very narrow, right? They see the problem and they just fix what they saw and observed, which is the same thing. And we'll talk in the final slide about mistakes companies make in responding to 483s that then lead to warning letters. Is this narrow thing? All right, FDA pinged us for making a mistake here. And so we focused all of our attention right there. And the idea is no, you need to broaden that investigation. And we'll talk about that on the last slide here.
Okay.
Um, but I see a lot of connections here, right? So the number two on this list is complaints. And more often than not, what it is FDA is picking them going, you didn't fully investigate the complaint and you didn't also trend it to get you into Kappa, right? So there's a connection here that great, you're analyzing your complaints, right? Maybe you are investigating them, you are capturing them, but you're not seeing the bigger picture of you're supposed to then look for certain trends, which should lead you into Kappa or other processes. And they're just not, again, they're taking that very functional, outdated view of the quality system instead of the process approach, and they're not connecting the dots here. Um, Design controls was interesting. It was up pretty high here on the list. Number three, could be number four. Those are the same as process validations, the next one. Um, and a lot of this quarter's design controls had to do with design validation, that a good chunk of companies are just not doing it, or not, they're certainly not doing it correctly.
Or what I've seen too recently is they'll conduct their design validation activities on what they called, their current frozen design, and then they make a design change before they actually release the product. And it's
Yeah.
like, no, wait, you didn't actually validate production equivalent, right? The
Yeah.
final release design.
Yeah, if you make a significant design change, you're no longer working from production equivalence. You have to start over. So, um, the next one that's cut off, it says it's actually for process validation, which includes equipment validation. And there were what, seven warning letters that cited that. And in a lot of cases, it's just not doing it. And I think again we have this issue where companies aren't making the right decision as to what has to be validated and what doesn't, right? Again, you don't have to validate every process, right? If you can basically inspect it using, proven inspection methods that are valid, then you don't have to validate the process, but you can't always do
I
that.
think there you hit a piece of process validation that people often miss, which is test method validation. It's a form of process validation.
Right.
It's what you often see because it's a process, right? Testing process. You see a testing process that they don't check. Obviously, you don't check it afterwards. That's what you're using it for.
Mhm.
But the question is, does it actually check what you think it checks? If it's not from a standard, you have to have a validation for that test method.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And so if I read between the lines on a lot of the warning letters here, that's kind of the gist of it, right? Is that they don't, they think they've got the process under control, but their methods are not validated or they're not based on scientific, analysis. And they're just kind of guessing. They're guessing at sample sizes and things like that, and there's no statistical basis for it. And FDA's gone, then that's not a valid test method, and then you'd have to validate the process because you don't have a fully verifiable process there. So yeah, I think that's another one of those areas where people just don't understand the concepts
well,
and they keep tripping across.
Steve, I don't have any problems with the product that's coming out of the process, so why do I have to validate it?
Yeah, everything looks great. What's the concern?
Like,
We've been lucky so far,
you've been lucky so far.
which is right. What
That's
it comes
that's
down to is they're basically saying without using those words, we're lucky. So why should we be concerned? And then number five on there is non-conforming product, and the dot 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 is rework, which was cited one or two times in warning letters. But the non-conforming product is it's not that they're not finding it; it's just they're not investigating it. And again, not looking for the trends, which doesn't lead you to Kappa, right? So they're not integrating this in with everything else. It's just like, yeah, we do our inline inspections or final inspections, and we pull side things and segregate them that aren't matching, you know, the specifications, and then we disposition them, but they're not trending that in any way.
we we throw away all the bad labels.
Yeah,
Okay, that
problem
that
solved.
that again is the correction. Where is the corrective action?
Right.
What's the
Yeah.
problem?
Yeah. And
You know,
so that's what
we
I
often say that
yeah.
100% inspection does not catch 100% of the problems.
No.
So if you find some non-conforming material, there's a good likelihood that some non-conforming material is getting past your process.
Yeah.
And
I
so
I I
not
went
find the
to
cause will be disservice.
yeah, I went to a human factors class long time ago in my career, early in my career. It was fascinating because the guy was kind of teaching us about the human limits of things like doing inspections. And it's actually, far lower than you would imagine. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's like your best inspector is maybe 35% effective.
Well,
Right? That's low. I mean, so why do we rely on that, right? See, we're 100%, like you said, whoa, 100% inspection, we're good. Yeah, but that's only 35% reliable. So, you know, and he said, so if you're only 35% effective, that means you're only catching a third of the problem. So if you find one problem, you've missed two, right? Or
well,
non-conformances. I actually did a quick experiment on that when I came back from that class on something very simple where I was working at the time, and he was dead on. And I had a bunch of people inspect something, and when they found one, then I handed it to somebody else to go look and see if there were any more, and that equation held up. That every time somebody found one thing, there were at least two more that the first inspector missed.
well.
It was like startling. So,
This is
all
this
right,
is why that's
yeah,
why you have to do those things, right? That's why when you have a non-conformance, you have to investigate. You have to determine if there's trends. You have to
hmm
search for cause and determine the need for corrective action. Fixing the problem is not good enough.
hmm
You have to actually prevent them from happening in the future.
Yeah, and then for those who really understand things like AQLs and sampling plans, right? It's that's why it's built in that, sometimes it's a double inspection plan, which is, well, if it failed the first criteria for AQL, you have to go back and then sample more or inspect the entire lot now, right? It's not just, oh yeah, look, oh, our AQL was 3, we had 2 bad items, we're good. Because we didn't take AQL. There should be something in your head that says, let's go back and maybe do a double inspection on this. We didn't
Because
hit
you've
our
now
open.
confirmed that there's failures in there.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it's telling you there are failures. Maybe you should do another pass here and see if you actually
It's one of the
still hit
reasons
your
that
AQL.
most of us don't use we always use C equals zero, right, in our sampling
Mhm.
plans, which
Sure.
allows zero failures. Because if you allow failures in your sampling plan, and there's plenty of them out there that are like that, but if you allow failures and you find one, you've now confirmed that there's failures in your process,
Yeah, I
right?
I've always felt that Z 1.4 and 1. What's the other one? 6,
Not nine.
9 are two of the most misused standards in the industry.
Well, yeah, because I mean AQLs and I tell this to people all the time and they don't realize AQLs have allowable failure levels. In other words, they can't give you any assurance that you're
Mhm.
100% good.
Right.
So
Yeah, there's a lot of
AQLs are not
subjectiveness in
great.
those
Right.
standards, and even if everybody jumps right to the tables at the end, right? They use the tables. If you read the rest of the standard, which is not an easy one to read, you can't. They'll tell you right in Z 1.4, this is not for everything.
Yeah.
There are certain processes this does not work for. Do not apply Z 1.4 to these type of processes. Yet that's what everybody uses. They just claim, oh yeah, we're following Z 1.4 for
Yeah.
everything. It's
We
like,
got ourselves kind of on sampling stuff, but because one of the things they say is, people throw around these 95, 95, 95, 90 and that kind of stuff, not realizing what that actually means, right? It's 95% confidence of 95% reliability. That means that you have no more than 5% failures.
mhm. Yeah.
You could have up to 5% failures, and you're only 95% sure of that.
Right? Yeah, people just don't think about what does this mean. It sounds great. 95%, that sounds really good. Right? Oh, maybe we should go to 99. Oh, I don't like the number of samples under 99. Let's stick to 95, 90. Right?
Yeah.
Because it goes up like exponentially. And oh no, I can't do that much inspection.
But we often talk about you have to understand the underlying assumptions, all of those types of things. People try to just blanket apply these things, and many times they actually still work, right?
Mhm.
But you have to understand those underlying assumptions, and much of that goes with this. When you talk about non-conforming material, and there's more of them out than what you actually identify in 100% inspection, there's an underlying assumption then that somehow 100% inspection is 100% effective, and it is simply not,
Right. So I
right?
think we found a good topic for another webinar
Yeah,
here because we've definitely gone down a tangent that could be really important to people. So let's keep that in mind for a future recording. So when we look on the drug side, there it's and not a total surprise, right? The CGMP kind of leads the way, but we know, drugs, right, is a little different beast, not a little different, quite a different beast than devices, right? Where there's not as much of an equivalent of design controls on the drug side.
right.
It's more about manufacturing, so not a surprise that the CGMP kind of leads the way. The surprise is the second column, right? No NDA at all. But I talked about that earlier about companies that are putting stuff on the market that you just don't realize is a drug. Hand sanitizer, sunscreen, these analgesic creams, right? And they don't realize those are drugs. So it's, look at this, 13 warning letters just in 1 quarter for companies that didn't bother to even, think about the NDA process. So those two far and away, right, lead the charge. I was kind of happy to see that labeling is not as big a deal, right? Because we used to always say labeling was always the number one source of recalls. Um, and that has to do with like labeling content there, right? So they're getting labeling content pretty well covered, but those CGMP and NDAs missing. are pretty critical. So looking at the CGMPs, obviously the categories are different than for a device. And as you know, as I read the warning letters every week, that receiving inspection piece, it's it's almost like a given that that's going to be the first paragraph or the first section of the warning letter. Um, and I think what it comes down to is companies are just over reliant on getting, certificates from their suppliers. And they get the C of A and they go, there we go, we got a C of A, just file it away, we're good. They don't look at it, they don't look to see what it says, they don't trend any of the information on the COA if they're even getting hard data. A lot of times they're just getting something that says, yes, this lot passed before we shipped it to you. And that's not what the regulations require. You have to pull samples, you have to confirm that the drug components you're receiving meet the specifications. And you can't just rely on the supplier to tell you that.
One of the things that I'd often do with this is I was working with the pharma companies
Mhm.
is ask them about what's their sampling of, the product coming in the door to
Mhm.
send to an independent test lab. Um, I've seen it way too often where that cert that they send you is a copy of the previous cert, right? And you can look at them and they look identical or nearly identical, and you have to start scratching your head saying, I'm not sure I believe this. And
Yeah.
understanding that you have to have those controls in place to be able to say, how often do we want to do this? How important is it that you know, this component has the appropriate, testing for either potency or, preventing contamination, all of those types of things.
Yeah, you and I did an audit together a couple of years back, and we saw something like that where the supplier was producing just huge bulk quantities that they would then pull from throughout the year. And so they would send a COA at the beginning of the year for that giant batch, and the company would file that away, and then every order they just pull from that giant batch that was sitting there with no further inspections of it, right? To see, well, wait, as it's sitting there, is it changing over time? Do we even know what the environmental conditions are that it has to be kept under, right? Is
Right.
the top of the bin the same as the bottom of the bin?
Right.
And
Well,
the
and I
company
mean,
was not curious at all about that, right?
this happens across the industry, right?
Mhm.
Of the supplier will make one run, produce a large quantity, and then it's supplier managed inventory, right? They just
Yeah.
keep a quantity on their shelf and just ship when you ask for it. You have to understand that that may constitute a different batch or a different lot, and you may need to do some testing again.
Mhm. Yeah. This next one always bothers me. That the inadequate quality unit. And I didn't break that down further, but you could. It comes in a lot of varieties, and but it just sort of speaks to not giving the quality group the authority it needs to do its job. Um, Part of it is that I'd say half the time it's just that you can kind of read between the lines and go, this is a quality unit that's being overridden by their management, so they have no authority. The other half of the time, it sounds like incompetence, that they're not
Yeah.
hiring competent personnel into the quality unit. Therefore, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing or what they're supposed to push back on. They just sort of check the box, check the box, check the box, and they move on. And or they don't adequately maintain records or don't know about integrity, which you can see further down the list here. Um, I will say in this case, there does seem to be a geographic element to this. This one seems to pop in more often outside the US than in US based companies. And I think that's probably something cultural, right? Where you get into more
Yeah.
hierarchical societies. And so you've got people in certain roles and they're just taught you don't speak back to somebody in management, right? Which is the wrong thing for a quality unit, right? You have to try to fix those cultural systemic issues there.
Well, and I tell organizations they need to look at their org chart and understand, where the influences are.
Hmm.
Um, having the quality unit report into the operations unit is really probably not the right place to have them report into,
No.
for sure. And then, like you're saying, some of the cultural things that can happen. Um, you look at organizations all the time, and when you walk in the front door, you might see the CEO's office in the corner, the next office next to him is operations, and you're like, where's the quality manager? Where's the quality unit head? And they're in the back with, manufacturing or where the test lab is at.
Right.
No, they have to have some equivalence, right? And understand that those things are the things that show up when an inspector walks in the door. They see those types of things, and then that puts it automatically in their mind. Does the quality unit have the right authorities? So,
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, those two again were kind of the top ones. You go to the next, you're gonna get the next four kind of somewhat equal. Not a surprise, lack of process controls. A lot of that had to do with cleaning. That's that about half of the ones related to process controls were related to cleaning, not being validated and not being managed correctly. Um, and again, you do see a geographic element there. OUS facilities definitely have a tougher time with their sanitary conditions. Um, Sometimes in really shockingly poor, you know, format. Um, and then the final inspection, I just like to call that one out because it's similar to the receiving one, right? They're not, it's usually together. The company's not bothering to inspect stuff coming in the door. They're not inspecting stuff before it goes out the door. Right? It's just like we set up our process, we validated our process, we're good, right? Everything coming out should be good. Our our supplier said the incoming goods are good. We go through the correct process. Why do we have to test it on the way out?
we only build good stuff.
Right, yeah. And again, nobody's complaining. It's just like, oh my gosh, you don't know for sure what's going on out there. And then you can see process validation. Stability was in there quite a bit as well. So they're making shelf life claims and they have no data to support that. Right? It's just sort of a guess, or they just did what somebody else did. Right? Well, this other company makes the same drug and they claim 3 years, so we're going to claim 3 years. It's
Well,
like, well, that's not really how it works, right? It's related to your process validations and your process controls and your inspections and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think they miss out on that pretty easily. All right, and then our last section here about so what do we see in the mistakes being made? Or again, it's sometimes the FDA is pretty clear and they say, well, in your response you said this. Other times you kind of got to read between the line and go and guess at, oh, I wonder what went wrong here. Um, this list hasn't changed from last quarter, although I color coded it a little differently. I put the three up there in red because to me those are kind of the things where you go, oh, come on. These these are the things you shouldn't get wrong in a response. All of them are things you shouldn't get wrong, but it's like you told FDA you took this action and you provided evidence, and the evidence shows it didn't work, and you still submitted it to FDA. What'd you think they were going to say? Right? When you say, "Oh yeah, here we tried to fix this problem. Here's what we did," and the FDA looks at the results and goes, "The problem's still there. Why are you submitting this?" That would seem to be pretty clear. That's almost like sort of like inspections, right? Whoever sent it didn't bother to actually read what they were sending on to FDA to see, well, what are we about to tell them? The illogical conclusions, that's, covers a lot of ground, and it's just we talked about, right? Companies are trying to tell FDA, no, 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 we understand your regulation better than you do, right? Things like that. Or, oh yeah, we did an investigation and here's what we think happened. And you go, there's no causality between those two things.
right?
That's just totally illogical, right? And it's just they're trying to make excuses, and what it really talks to is they probably didn't do much of an investigation. And then the third one is just to me is like I can't understand this. How do you not remember to address everything that they observed? Where you look at an FDA goes, your response did not address this issue. It's like, come on, how do you not respond to everything in the 483?
Well, this is where you'd always say, did you have an independent person look at it? Right? This is
Right.
where consultants earn their keep to me, is you can easily identify these top things,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
the FDA letter has A, B, C, D, E, and you only have A, B. Where's the rest of it?
Mhm.
Right? Those types of things that are quick to identify by an independent person looking at these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, those A, B might have been really important things, and it took you a lot of effort to do that. But if you didn't address all of them, and I've seen it again, that sometimes what they did actually did address those things. They just didn't put that evidence in the response letter, right?
Yeah, and that kind of gets to the next one, right? The no evidence of progress or completed actions. And you say, yep, we fixed this. And FDA is going, where's your proof? Right?
Right.
Or we've opened this CAPA and we're making good progress. Where? What have you gotten done? Show us, you know? So yeah, that one's there. The inadequate actions, again, where, again, this is what we talked about earlier. I think it's more like they're focused on corrections, not corrective action.
Right.
And FDA is going, this isn't going to be sufficient to prevent recurrence. Right? You know, sorry, this is interesting, but you didn't really get to the crux of the problem, which kind of gets to the last bullet of not properly determining the causes or the root causes, right? Which just sounds like you're guessing at it, or you just took the least burdensome approach or the path of least resistance. Um, and I talked about earlier about, right, not expanding the investigation beyond the observation. You know, and that's why there's always that language in there that says, this is not an all-inclusive list. Right? You always get that from FDA. They're telling you this is what we observed. You're responsible for finding the rest of it. We're just
Right.
saying, look, the evidence is here that you're doing something wrong. You tell us how broad it is. But, you know,
I like that second to last bullet there too, Steve, because if you've been through the FDA inspections, when they are talking about 483 observations,
mhm.
you have to respond to the inspector when he outlines them. And usually the response is acknowledge and promise to correct, right? You're in the final meeting, you don't have to provide any direct plans. That's not an adequate response to a written letter, right?
Right.
Once you have it, you actually have to have a detailed plan.
Yeah.
And the detailed plan includes an adequate investigation. It identifies the cause and root cause if you're able to, and then you have actions that are being taken. And then you show that those actions were completed. And then you show that those actions were actually effective, that it worked. All of those things are required to close
Yeah.
those things out.
I know. I read way too many of these warning letters where basically I could just sum it up. They just go, yeah, sorry about that. We'll do better next time.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's not an adequate response.
No.
You're just begging for the warning at that point. You know, it's like this is not about apologies. It's like I said, it's about action and improving the effectiveness of those actions. So, all right. So, any other thoughts on this?
I think the biggest thing, again, I come back to is, as you're making these responses, interface with your network, whether that involves consultants or just some other quality regulatory professionals to make sure that you can get a second set of eyes on these things to understand it, because all of us use that experience to be able to get the best response. We don't want any of our friends to be in trouble, right? We don't want any of our enemies to be in trouble, really. But but the thing is, I just ask you, what does it take? Most consultants are less than $400 an hour. Um, what does it take to just get, because this is going to cost you money. This is going to cost you R&D effort. It's going to cost you all of these things
Reputation,
in
right?
reputation. It's just too much risk to not spend a little bit of time. And maybe there's somebody else that you have in your network that, can use the help too, and you can trade services.
Yeah.
Or worst case, again, find a
Well, I always
consult.
liken it to, right? You're not, right? Everybody knows you're not supposed to audit yourself, right? This is another version of that. You're going to write a response and then assume you got it right. Well, you have your own natural biases, right? And I usually challenge, like, why do you think that the same people who got you into this situation are the ones who can get you out of it?
And just like happens in every case,
Mhm.
once quality looks at it and you're writing it, likely nobody else in the organization is going to look at it with those eyes. Even the top management and those types of people, they just don't have the same eyes that the quality and regulatory professionals have.
Mhm.
And they're going to assume that you are doing your job.
Yeah,
So
right.
don't risk it.
Yep. Get another opinion. Right? All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end here. Thank you, everybody, for watching. As always, we're available. If you have further questions, you can hit us up at our contact email or message us on LinkedIn. The QR code will take you to our company's LinkedIn page. Please follow us because, as I said, we post all kinds of good stuff every day. And every Wednesday, we specifically focus on warning letters. And we have new kinds of information coming soon that'll be very interesting and exciting. So definitely
And if
follow
you
us.
have ones you want to point out to us, if we missed something along the lines, hit us up with that too, because we'll make sure that we call you out and give you credit, and then we can make sure that the industry gets better.
Yeah, because there's like a dozen new warning letters every week. We pick one and go after it. And if you say, "Oh, I would have really liked if you looked at this one," let us know. We'll jump in and do another post and give our opinion on that. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.